So, hi everybody. I'm Allison Williams, the Library Services Coordinator, and I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Catherine Benton Cohen to the Copper Queen Library and this special program. Uh, Dr. Benton Cohen is a professor of history at Georgetown University, and her most recent book is Inventing the Immigration Problem, the Dillingham Commission and Its Legacy from Harvard Press, 2018. And she's also the author of Borderline Americans. And Katie also participated in the deportation centennial a few years ago and came here to visit us in Bisbee. And we had actually hoped to have her in person again this year, but we are so grateful for virtual programs and the ability to reach more people and people in different places. And so welcome everybody, and welcome Katie, I will say, but I do like to call you Dr. Benton Cohen, but it is long. So
It is.
could you just start us off by telling us about the project you're working on right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And are you going to admit people? I'm just in some co-host
Yes,
phase.
I will manage everything. And I want to let everybody know that the chat function is available to you as well. So sometimes when somebody else is speaking, it might spark a thought or a story or a question. You can write that in the chat box and we can get to it a little bit later. So feel free to use that when you want to, as well as unmuting or raising your hand.
Yeah, I'm actually going to put some information here just super quickly. There's my email because I'll introduce myself and my goals today in a second. And here is a bio if you don't know me. But anyway, I want to say thanks again to Allison. I wish that I could be in person because I love the library so much, but I was in Bisbee a month ago. So I think I've actually been 3 times in the last year because I think I was in withdrawal after COVID. It's really lovely to be with old friends and new and family members. And I want to just kind of introduce myself for those who don't know me, and then introduce what I hope to do today, which I hope is really just an opening conversation. I'm Katie Benton Cohen. I'm a professor of history at Georgetown University. Before I get further than that and things that are much more relevant to Phelps Dodge and to Bisbee, I will say that I am actually in Nova Scotia, Canada right now, which is 4 hours later than Arizona. I'm not a night person. It's 9:30. 2 things are possible. Well, 3 things are possible. I'll fall asleep. A sleepy 7-year-old will interrupt this. I did get him to bed before this began. Or a gust of wind will blow this tension rod off onto my head. So I am prepared for all those eventualities, but I wanted you to be prepared as well. What I wanted to say that's relevant to today is that I like to joke that I'm still Katie from the block. I'm born and raised in Arizona. I'm from Tempe originally. And my mother and my grandfather are from the border. My grandfather was born in Douglas and my mother grew up in El Paso. And although my grandfather's family didn't stay in Douglas long and didn't work for Phelps Dodge, I feel a real kinship with the region. I am writing a global history. If you look at that little blurb there, a global history of the Phelps Dodge family and corporation, encompassing their origins in Connecticut and in Puritan Connecticut and New York, their rise to prominence in New York, followed by their development of copper mining in the American Southwest, and then what I call a kind of third-legged stool. So one leg is New York, Connecticut, Princeton. The second leg is the Southwest copper borderlands, and the third leg is their role in developing and running the American University of Beirut, which what I've come to learn through my own personal and professional travels are 3 inextricable parts of the Phelps Dodge family story. And some people in different regions are very knowledgeable about each piece of those, but there's never really been a history that connects the 3. And my scholarly work began with a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, which became my first book, Borderline Americans, which is a kind of history of race in Cochise County. I lived there as a young whippersnapper in my 20s for almost a year, doing research in the late 1990s. And that book, it became the book Borderline Americans, which you can get from the Copper Queen Library. You can also purchase at the Bisbee Mining Museum, published by Harvard Press in 2009. And on the basis, and then I wrote another book about immigration history, and that's kind of a sidebar I won't get into. Although I will say that what I realized is that the first book was about immigrants, but the second book was about immigration policy. And then right when my second book came out, I was involved as historical advisor for the film Bisbee 17, which I assume most of the people in the audience are familiar with. And I worked with the director, Robert Greene, and it was really exciting for me. I made new friendships. Charles, for example, I reignited old relationships that I had with people in Bisbee. Last week's guest, Becky Orozco, is a dear friend. I've known her since I was about 25. So it was really exciting to reconnect with those folks. And then what happened is, because I'm on the East Coast, but I have roots in Arizona, I ended up attending about a dozen of the Bisbee 17 screenings across the country, including in New York, Milwaukee, obviously in Arizona, San Francisco, Washington, DC. And Robert, the director, and I, both when we were at events that we attended together and separately, had so many people come to us all over the country and tell us stories about the Phelps Dodge family or the Phelps Dodge Corporation, or their family growing up in the company town, or their old money East Coast family having a family country home next to the Dodges and never knowing about the Arizona side of the story. And I had already known a little about the Dodges' really central role at Princeton University, but I hadn't known the extent of it until I started digging in a little. And very coincidentally, since I'm a graduate of the humble Tempe High School, I went to Princeton University. And when I realized how deeply connected the Dodge family was with Princeton, for example, Cleveland Dodge was Woodrow Wilson's #1 campaign contributor. He gave Woodrow Wilson a Rolls Royce after he finished his second term, to give you an idea of their relationship. He lent his yacht to Woodrow Wilson for a week to recuperate between his first and second terms. And I thought, I like to joke, it was like my Beto moment. I was like, I was born to do this thing. And I realized that I really desperately wanted to write the first big unauthorized history of Phelps Dodge. And I decided that in probably late 2018, I jettisoned another book project and I began doing it. And in some ways, right, it starts with Bisbee for me because it's a place that I think of myself as a kind of insider outsider because I've spent so much time there. It gives me a kind of home place and a starting place, but because my first book finished at the beginning of World War II, this is really new work for me because this book is going to span from the colonial era, from the 18th century, all the way to the sale to Freeport-McMoRan. So what I've done in recent months, because COVID really slowed me down, really put a pause on it. I had a young child at home and I was teaching at Georgetown full time and I obviously couldn't travel. I did some Zoom interviews, but now I'm really back at it in full vigor. And I'm actually planning a trip to Beirut in September to visit AUB. I have been interviewing and doing a lot of research on the post-war 1960s, 80s strike era, obviously, history of Phelps Dodge. All right, so that's how I come to this project. What I wanted, and that's really actually all I want to say about me with regard to this project, unless you want to ask me questions. But what I want to do today is I really have 3 goals. I've already achieved one. I wanted to introduce myself. My second goal was to hear your stories and get your contacts or suggestions of other people that you might know. These are stories of working for Phelps Dodge, living in Phelps Dodge company towns, interacting with the family, because I'm particularly interested in the nexus between the family and the company. And I can say more about that if you have questions. So that's the second thing. And that's the main objective today, is really to hear from you. And that's goal 2. And goal 3 is also hearing from you. And it's a continuation. A couple of you might have been in the audience when I gave a talk at the symposium, the academic symposium 5 years ago, that was part of the centennial. And in that talk, what I copped to is that I really owe my entire career to Bisbee and Cochise County. I have benefited professionally and personally. I have a fancy job at an East Coast school. I have tenure. I published a book with Harvard University Press related to the history of Cochise County. And I want to hear ideas. I have my own ideas, but I'd like yours on how this project can give and not just take, right? That I don't want this to be another extractive enterprise of copper mining and smelting towns, but also something that is interactive and meaningful to communities. I already have lots of ideas about community archives and oral histories that are available to people, but I would love to hear what you all first want to share with me about this history, and secondly, how you think this history should be shared and co-owned. That's really important to me. And part of the project is, in fact, kind of thinking reflectively about the responsibility of historians to the communities that they write about. So I've done point 1, which is introduce myself, and point 2 and 3, hearing about Phelps Dodge and your ideas about collaboration, are points 2 and 3. And I'm really going to open it up to you at this point.
This would be a great time for somebody to raise their hand, or I can start. In fact, I will ask you if what you think about this, if this is relevant, but it's not my story. Glenn Mineth, who is here with us, also does programs for the Copper Queen Library. And he led an architectural tour for us. And the highlight going up to the Copper Queen Hotel. And Glenn told us the history of the architect and the family connection, nepotism. And so, Glenn, what do you think? Is this a story you could share with Katie?
Yes. The situation was that the architect for the Copper Queen Hotel, which Phelps Dodge built or had built, was from the East Coast. In other words, he was also very young. He didn't have much on the way of experience under his belt, and he was partnered with somebody else. But the point was, how in the world would a Phelps Dodge location being a mining town, how would they choose somebody on the East Coast who mainly did rich people's homes? That was what they did up to that point. And it turns out, I just cut to the chase here, what Allison was getting at. He was from a large family, and the relative, and I'm forgetting now, I'd have to look it up. I think it was his father, or the relative at least, was on the board of Phelps Dodge, and then you can realize right there, the story kind of stops and you say, oh, I get it. And that's it. So that's the example that it kind of mushrooms out. And it's just not talking about Phelps Dodge, it's talking about impacts to architecture, to humanity, and why we're living with a hotel that looks like that today, and the people that built it. And as a spinoff, I didn't cover this during my architecture tour, but what I was going to suggest for tonight was in other tours that I do about Warren, where Warren is, the company, the so-called company town. Phelps Dodge has had different arrangements, so I understand. And there's the point of confusion. And maybe in a book like yours, you could dissect it enough to understand what's going on. And what I'm getting at is, in some company towns, the company builds the homes and then rents them out. In other homes and other towns, this company builds the homes and then sells them. I've always been told Bisbee, the company never owned the homes, but the miners always always owned the homes, had bought the homes from the start. And of course, in other company towns, when the mine closes, they sell out the company-owned homes. Like over in New Mexico, Tyrone would be a good example of that.
Yeah.
So I'm not asking you for any clarification, and I was just suggesting that arrangement might be something you would explore, and what Phelps did, why they did one and not the other, in certain locations.
So just a couple, because I mostly want to hear from people, but actually I am totally fascinated by Warren, and Warren, the papers that were originally the Calumet and Arizona's papers that Phelps Dodge then acquired, I actually kind of fell into my hands. It was one of those kismet moments that happens to historians. I was reading microfilm in 1998 or 9 or something in the Bisbee Mining Museum, and an architectural historian came in and he had gotten access to those papers, which I didn't have access to. And it blew open my whole project for the reasons that you said, because there was this plan to sell homes instead of rent them, because they thought it would make good Americans. And it was really originally CNA's plan. So I actually write about that in Borderline Americans. If you want to take a look, I'd love to get your take as a local historian. It's called A Better Man for Us. I think it's chapter 4, but I read the book a long time. I wrote the book a long time ago. But I would love actually to get your feedback. And it is in noted contrast to their other towns, right? That, think of Morenci, that is a straight up company town. There's also a historian named Bob Vitalis at University of Pennsylvania. He's really a political scientist, and he wrote about Aramco in Saudi Arabia, and he realized he traced David Dodge, who's a descendant, right, who was one of the presidents of AU Beirut. David Dodge worked for Aramco in the 1940s, and he gave Aramco the idea of company towns modeled on Phelps Dodge. So there is this like mushrooming process that you describe that's super interesting. And I absolutely want to deal with the double-edged sword of paternalism in company town. So I would love to get your take on that, because that's really fascinating to people outside the region. They can't believe that they ever existed or that they exist now.
I will leave it at that, except to say that Warren, as I understand it, was modeled after a program that was across the America continent, and that was the City Beautiful project. So maybe under the City Beautiful concept, people had to own their own homes, and I'll just end it at that on my end.
Yeah, we'll continue that conversation for sure. Thanks.
Who would like to go next?
Can I jump in here?
I was
Allison?
going to call on you. Yes, Charles.
Hi, Charles.
I just want to make one comment about the company housing, and fast forwarding into the latter part of Phelps Dodge's active working in Bisbee in the 1950s and 60s. After the Lavender Pit was started in 1951, they moved a bunch of houses from Jiggerville and from Upper Lowell and from Johnson Addition, and created Bakerville basically, and Saginaw. But they built 2 divisions of new homes. One is called Galena, which is still there, and the other is Briggs, which is also still there. Briggs is over by what used to be the road up to South Bisbee.
Yeah, what's the first one? I know about Briggs.
Galena, and it's right down.
Galena, yeah, of course,
Galena,
yeah.
right down by the Campbell Shaft there.
Yep.
Well, the thing, when I was growing up, and those were relatively new houses, they were rented, not sold. And they were, I think, about $35 a month, maybe.
Yeah.
And then the company provided, they didn't pay the utilities, but they provided upkeep, on those,
right,
because they belonged to the company. When Phelps Dodge left in 1976, maybe, then the houses were sold to those who wanted to buy them. People that had lived there for a while, who were going to stay in Bisbee, could purchase the house. Others could come and purchase them if they were available. So that's a little bit of information about the housing situation. Katie, I wanted to just throw one more thing in as the discussion goes forward. And this is not a deportation discussion, but in terms of Phelps Dodge and the deportation story, it is not a finished story. It is not, there is much still about that. And a lot of it has to do with the role that Phelps, it was a Phelps Dodge thing. And a lot of it has to do, I think, with how Phelps Dodge tried to manage that story for so many years, coming down to right where we are now. And I think that's one reason why I'm just fascinated by what you're doing, because you know, Phelps Dodge looms large in our lives for a number of reasons. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Charles, you and I need to speak outside of school, because my research over the last couple of years outside of Arizona, like PD sources elsewhere, has definitely revealed some new information.
Oh.
And I would love, I'm not prepared to share it here, but I would love for us to confab at some point and
That'd be
definitely,
great. That'd be great.
yeah, I'd love to do it.
And also, you know, I was on the deportation committee as well, and Becky and I were just talking about it. For those of you, so for the centennial, we had a committee to discuss how we were going to present the not celebration, but commemoration of the centennial of the deportation. And on that committee were many historians and me. I was a non-historian. And from that centennial to today has been an amazing amount of new research, new stories, new understanding, and in fact, that history is this living thing, not just that we're living through history, but that in the present, we continue to work and uncover and look for new information, new details. And Mike Anderson definitely unearthed a huge amount of new information. But now also with the film, with Bisbee 17, there's now more resources, more books, but pre-centennial, we just didn't have the same level of information. And so, Charles, that goes to what you were saying about, you know, this kind of more active narrative, you know, of the public-facing narrative that PD put it out, and how we are even changing today. But Charles, I was wondering, I might be misremembering this, but a long time ago, you told me a story about growing up here, and it was a story about the hospital, where the old hospital was, and you, did you work there or?
Well, I did, you know, not to get too far off field here, but you know, when Phelps Dodge was running the town, running our lives, if your parents worked for the company, or your parent worked for the company, and you were going to school in college or university, if you wanted to work in the summer, all you had to do was call, and then you had a job. So a lot of us did that in the summers from when we weren't staying where we were in school. And they provided jobs for us. And I actually worked at the hospital because both of my parents were employed there. So, but in terms of the hospital history, Phelps Dodge, there were two hospitals. When Calumet, Arizona was here, they built a hospital state of the art up on top of the hill up there, which is still there today, and which became an apartment building. Phelps Dodge had to move its hospital 3 times. You know, it was a makeshift hospital down in, which is now part of the pit, but at the base of Sacramento Hill. The underground mining destabilized the earth, so they built a railroad siding up to that place, loaded it onto railroad cars, and moved it to Upper Lowell, I think, where it sat for a few years. And then the ground became unstable there also. So then they put the hospital where it was until 1961, which was in downtown Bisbee. The clinic and dispensary were on the ground level in Copper Queen Plaza, and those of you who are around here know where that is. And then the hospital was the second floor of that building, and it actually was entered from Howell Avenue by the Copper Queen Hotel. But that was, and one of my questions about Phelps Dodge, and Katie, you'll probably, maybe there'll be a kernel of something about this, was why when they became the sole operating company here, when Calumet, Arizona left, why they didn't take that hospital and use it, because it was much more modern than anything that they had used up to that time. But anyway, that's a little hospital background.
And also that relationship between that company town relationship I find it very interesting that, that if your parents worked for the company, you had a job
Yeah.
that summer.
Yeah, well, and the other thing, I
That
mean,
a lot of towns.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a, I mean, if we talk and we hear a lot, we have heard a lot in recent years about the evils of socialized medicine. But in point of fact, that's exactly what it was.
Mhm.
If you needed to go to the doctor, you went down to the dispensary, put your name on the list, and they called your name, and you went in to see the doctor. The doctor gave you a prescription. You went down the hall to the pharmacy. They gave you the pills, and you went home. No money changed hands. Nothing was charged. If you had to go in the hospital for a surgery, you went in the hospital. They performed it. I mean, if you were a company employee or a family of a company employee. So it was a very much that relationship that we've all sort of talked about in terms of Phelps Dodge.
I'll say one of the things that's been really fascinating to me is starting last summer, I started going to, I mean, because I grew up in Tempe and my family, took road trips and so forth. I'd been to many, I've been to Globe, for example, a number of times. I've been to Jerome. I had actually never been to Clifton Morenci because it's pretty remote. And I'm embarrassed to say I've never been to Ajo. That will happen. It's not the most attractive summer vacation trip, I'll be honest. But I did actually, I have a close friend from graduate school whose father was a company doctor in Ajo for PD in the 70s and early 80s. And he loved it. And he told a lot of interesting stories about what it was to be a company doctor for PD. And he had some, there were some things that happened that were a little sketchy, but overall, like the experience of being that doctor and providing care in the way that Charles described he loved it. He absolutely loved it. And in fact, I interviewed him and his wife, who, was dragged there as a doctor's wife with young children. You could tell did not like it as much as he did. Like it was so rewarding for him to be the company doctor and to be known and loved, and it really shows, I think, a theme that's already coming out is this is not a black hat, white hat story, right? Like paternalism of Phelps Dodge really cut both ways. And I've seen that. I also spent some time in Clifton Morenci and I was totally fascinated there, like ground zero of the 83 strike, really complex views about Phelps Dodge from people on sort of both sides of the strike. And that to me makes the story really interesting instead of just like flat and straightforward. So I'm enjoying all that all those new things I'm learning in new places.
Would somebody else like to raise your hand, Christine? Or nope.
I'd like to mention something. I used to work for Phelps Dodge in Ajo during the 80s, and everything that's being said is pretty much true of that as far as the paternalism. I never lived in company housing. I always stayed kind of in private residence, but two of my kids were born in Ajo, and because I worked for the mine, there was no charge.
Yeah.
My kids were basically born for free, and my other family members did have company housing, and it was fairly cheap. And the mercantile store, you just had to sign. I had a young sister. She was about 7 or 8 at the time, and she would go down to the store and pick up items and just sign for it. And later on, my dad would, fix up the bills and everything. But it was something. It was a tough company to work for, and I was really glad the union was there because they really did help a lot of the situations. And when Ajo closed down, they did sell the houses that were company houses to anybody that wanted to buy them. And so Ajo has really kind of revitalized itself. I go once in a while, but it's not like it used to be as far as you knew who everybody was. You'd stop on the streets. Heck, you'd stop on the roads in your car and nobody would get mad. They'd just go around you, you do your talking and everything. So it was quite an experience. And just for the record, I was born in Bisbee. It must have been the Copper Queen Hospital, but I do have ties to Bisbee. I haven't been there in a long time, but it's still quite a place.
Bob, where do you live now?
I live in Tucson. I'm retired.
How
but,
did you hear about this event?
I get email notices from CQL.
The
Okay.
library, from the library. Bob, it's great to have you here. It's really great.
I hope you'll share your contact with me. If you know how to use chat, you could send me your email if you have an email. I guess you do because you get the library messages.
Can I just extend Bob's remarks a little bit regarding the company store, which
Yeah.
Phelps Dodge owned everything, of course. But one of the interesting things about it was when there was a labor strike in Bisbee, credit was extended at the
I
store.
know.
People could still buy groceries and they could buy school clothes. They couldn't buy big ticket purchases like appliances or things like that.
Oh, so
But
there were rules.
there were rules, but if they were paying off a washer and a dryer, for instance, or refrigerator, the payments were suspended until the strike was over. So, and you know, there are two views of that. You might say, well, that means the company was a pretty good-hearted boss, and I guess you could say that, but it also kept people here so that when that strike was over, they could just go back to work. You know, they didn't have to have a big startup, you know. But it
Charles,
was interesting. So people didn't go hungry. They weren't out of their houses, and you know, and they could buy school clothes for the kids. So
Charles, I'm so glad that you added that particular detail because so as a historian, one of the ways that I explain to people about what we do, and I recently had a wonderful, wonderful undergraduate this spring who was a graduating senior going to medical school, and he's a scientist. He's taking this intro history class. And he's an Ethiopian immigrant. I'm getting sidetracked, but he was just like this wonderful, curious, sponge, ideal student. And he kept coming to office hours. And one of the things that he asked me was, well, but how do you know if something's true in history? He's like, in science, I can do an experiment and I can show a result and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, you know, it's not as objective as that. I said, but one thing that happens is when I look at a number of different kinds of sources and they all point me in the same direction, then I'm like, once there's just layers that are saying the same things, once you start getting repetition, you recognize, right, that from different kinds of sources, there's something there. And Charles, because I was recently researching the 1968 strike onward, I came across this very thing, and I have the same take as you about the two ways you could take it. And I think it's a classic example of two things are true at the same time. I think that both of those things were happening, right?
I agree with that. Yes.
And I also learned something you'll like, because I'm trained by a structural historian who always wants to tell us the ways that the world shapes our choices. I learned that Arizona was one, if not the only, was one of the only states in the country in which striking workers cannot collect welfare benefits.
Oh, didn't know that.
So in the 1968 non-ferrous metal strike, I'll get really particular here, right? So it was across the copper industry, and it was huge. There were like thousands of people on strike in this strike I'd never heard of until this spring, okay? There was actually a big article about it in the New York Times Magazine, and it pointed out a lot of people in other states, including even Utah, right? States that are similar to Arizona, were collecting welfare benefits. But the Arizona strikers, who were probably the largest number, could not collect welfare while they were doing this. And I'm wondering if that's also part of the piece, is that Phelps Dodge knew that that was going to blow back on them. It doesn't, and you know, again, you could look at that both ways. They don't want people to starve, right? Yeah, and they know it's bad publicity. Like, so I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I trust you as a source, and you're kind of like underscoring something I'm seeing that I find really intriguing, and that frankly, I think readers outside the region would find interesting, right? There's something, as you all know, very exotic about this world to a lot of people outside of the region. And I simultaneously want to engage that interest and also not make people in company towns exotic. Try to do both those things at the same time.
It's hard though, like with Morenci, the first time I met a librarian from Morenci at a library conference, I said, wait, what? You're a Freeport employee. So the Morenci library, the librarians, all the staff, they are Freeport employees. So in the state of Arizona, of all the libraries, Morenci is the last one that those librarians are still mining employees, which
Unbelievable.
the Copper Queen Library was until 1974, I believe, when they gave the library to the city. But up until that point, all of the librarians were mining employees, not city employees.
So Allison, I went to the Morenci Library to use the internet when I was there last summer. I actually had a bald, this was like the height of the bad rental car situation, right? In the US, like the shortage of rental cars. And I got a rental car in Phoenix that had so bald that I was fishtailing up to Clifton Morenci, and I had to get a rental car's tire replaced. So I was in Morenci for about 4 hours. And I went over to the library, and the first thing I did was look at their local history section, and they had like Jim Burkett in there. They had stuff that was not pro PD, and my mind was blown. So that is
And
fascinating.
go to the movie theater, the gym, the community center, the
The
theater,
daycare center, the pool.
that are all part of this like library / community. I mean, the librarians from Morenci came down to visit with James and myself, and it was, I have to say, exotic, asking them so many questions. So just that's the company town thing
Totally agree with you.
in
Totally agree.
the present day. Is there somebody else?
I saw someone's hand raised. Glenn's iPad is raised.
Hi, my name is Glenn Peterson. I live in Agoura, California, and I was born in Globe. And I'm the great grandparents of Jim, James, and Margaret Letson. This predates Freeport McMoran. Jim Letson, his wife made all the money. She grub stake miners.
The Letsons, yeah.
Yeah, she made money by grub staking miners. And at one point, the books say that she had half of Main Street. She owned half of Main Street. So that says a lot about the fact that miners didn't make money. The people provided miners made all the money. And that's so true. And but anyways, they built the Letson, what is now the Letson's Lofts. He was on the first city council in Bisbee. My mom was born in LA, but she came to Bisbee, and my grandfather worked in the mines. However, he kept passing out in the mines, so they fired him. But he lived in Warren, and then they moved to Globe, and he worked for State Highway. He never passed out on State Highway. So and I had cousins that lived in Inspiration. My dad worked for Inspiration for a while, but he realized that he was the timekeeper, and he was number 6 in line, and he figured he'd never had any chance of going anywhere. So he went on, and that brought us to California. But Maggie Letson was quite a lady, and she's buried at the cemetery there.
Yeah, she's amazing. I have a little bit of research from her all the way from when I was a graduate student. If you'll share your email with me, I'll try to look it up in my
Sure. I got a lot of pictures. I've got a lot of pictures too.
Cool. Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thanks for coming. I feel like I'm on a talk show, where I'm following Glenn. Here's Glenn from California.
And here's Donnie.
Glenn, are you also on our email list? Is that how you
I got this through Chris Martin, is it? From maybe not Christine Martin from Arizona State. She's
from Christine Marin. Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Oh,
I've known her since I was like 21. I'm gonna go get a glass of water. Hold on.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad that you're joining us. And
excellent.
yeah, Letson Lofts is still on Main Street. Of course, that building is very interesting.
Well, she owned a good portion of that south side of Main Street there, where the Letson block is at one point. So she was one of those opportunistic entrepreneurs that became part of the culture in that mining town.
Actually, some of her grub staking ended up in the claims because the guys couldn't pay her. So they gave her the claims, and she ended up owning those claims and getting paid for by Freeport McMoran and later Phelps. But by Freeport McMoran and prior to that, Phelps Dodge. But it's kind of interesting. My grandmother used to get payments from my uncle because his name was James Letson, and he just kept the deeds.
That's smart.
Yeah.
That's
All right.
so interesting. And that I wanted to, I'm not sure if it's relevant, but Glenn Mineth and Charles both brought up, and you too, Katie, the difference between owning houses and renting and these different neighborhoods and communities. And so about 10, maybe 14, 15 years ago, when it was PD, they were looking at buying back all the property on Erie Street in Lowell, quite possibly to mine or whatever. And so it turned out that, which I hadn't realized, and it was the same thing with South Bisbee, is that while these individuals owned these buildings, they, on these certain neighborhoods, they only owned, it was something like 18 inches or 36 inches below the topsoil. And that the rest of the property below there was either a 50-year lease or a 100-year lease in many cases. Do you remember this, Charles?
Oh, yeah, it's still the case. You may recall a few years ago that the Lutheran Church in Warren down on Arizona Street closed, and they were giving their building away to another nonprofit,
You said in Lowell?
in Warren on Arizona Street.
Arizona Street.
And
Okay.
they wanted to give the building to another nonprofit. They didn't want to sell it. So I was involved with a little bit just because of the nonprofit side of it. And one of the things that we discovered was that they could give their building to anybody they wanted to, but they had to get basically a quit claim from Freeport for the mineral rights and everything below the building, because they still own all of that. And I think that's probably pretty widespread throughout the community even today.
Yeah, it depends where it is. I hadn't realized it was in different places of Warren until that happened with that church.
Right.
Christine?
Those were 99-year leases.
Mhm.
And when the 99 years was up, the mining company and the individuals really didn't know what to do. And lawyers had to hash it out. And those are questions that somebody from Freeport or Phelps Dodge could answer. But when the 99-year lease was up on a lot of properties in Old Bisbee, there was confusion about how they should proceed.
So I think most people here know Christine, but for those who don't, I'm thinking of my in-laws. This is Christine Rhodes, who was for, I'm going to try to think about this, almost 40 years,
44 years.
44 years, the county recorder in
Yes.
Cochise County. So she knows a lot about things like 99-year leases.
Yes.
And I actually I've known Christine for a really long time, but I also interviewed her last month. Yeah, no, I heard about the 99-year lease. I'll just share one thing because I've had the opportunity right now to go to some of the other towns over the last year. And I had the amazing opportunity to spend like a 3-hour Jeep tour with a retired PD employee in Morenci. And he gave me a tour of the whole pit and site, which was just incredible. And he told me about his, in Morenci, it is the norm to rent. It's the much more pure company town. Most of you know that, but for those of you who don't. But one thing he shared with me, Charles, in addition, was that you could make improvements on your house, and granted, those would then belong to PD, but they would let you make all kinds of alterations. So he actually ended up building an addition on his house, and he put in central air conditioning. And I think he worked out some arrangement where, they paid for the supplies. There was some compensation where it was like sweat equity, but he was improving their property. And that was surprising to me because obviously most landlords don't let you alter properties, but Phelps Dodge realized that that was actually a win-win for them because they ended up with
the houses that they built here in the 1950s, ones that are in Galena and Briggs, are really basic. They're little
Right.
four-room houses.
Mhm.
And so they were, and I understand, I have heard that too. and I know that over time that I knew people who actually, they added something to the house or they changed something about it. But I think that was probably, again, it's a situation of, we're gonna build these houses and rent them to you for next to nothing. And, and we'll take care of the upkeep. But if you want to do something that makes it better for you, that's fine. We'll just own it when you leave,
Right.
And that was kind of the way it was, so.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. Yeah. So I don't want to call people out of turn, but I noticed that Bill Malik, who actually sent an email that Allison shared with me about getting a PD scholarship, if you're willing to share that story or anything else, that was.
Oh, sure. So
interesting.
Charlie, I haven't seen you in probably 50 years.
At least.
So yeah, my family moved to Bisbee in 1964. My mom was one of the first teachers hired at Cochise College. And so me and my younger sister, Jane, who lives in Phoenix, lived out in San Jose Estates. I got a National Merit Scholarship that was funded by PD. And I'm trying to think where this would have been on the timeline, because the scholarship was based on the SATs, and I would have taken those in January or February of '68. So I actually got the notice that I was a scholar before my senior year. But
I think that's how it works even now. Yeah.
Yeah. So the tidbit that I wanted to share was, when I did get to college, I contacted PD in Manhattan and said I'd like to come down and say thank you and visit. And so I took the train down from Boston to New York for like a 9 a.m. meeting. And what I didn't realize when I made that reservation was that I had to leave the night before. So I ended up sleeping in the Grand Central Station in my suit. But I went to PD headquarters and I spent a couple of hours with George Monroe and two of the other executives. At that time, he was the CFO.
Yeah.
And very, very gracious. I mean, very much business-like people. They didn't, like buy me lunch or anything, but fascinating conversation. I'd never been, I'd been in New York City once many years earlier and didn't remember it well. But the one thing I recall was he said, we've been doing these things for a lot of years and you're the first person who ever said thanks, which I think tells you a little bit more about my character than about PD's character. There was one other thing that I heard, and listening to you, I just wanted to, it's a story I heard on a drive. I have a wonderful photograph I've posted on Facebook of me and Mark Padovan and Lori Christo, and maybe it was Cliff and one other. We went to a science thing, and the fellow who drove the car was a former PD engineer, and this would have been 1967 or 68. He was retired, but what he told me was that they'd run a test hole in the side of a hill just north of the split in Brewery Gulch. So basically due north of the Copper Queen library. And the drill bit snapped off. And he said they sent a winch down and pulled the thing out. And what had happened is, his story, I have no physical evidence, that the bit had encountered a vein of pure gold, spun it into thread, and seized the drill bit. Now, they didn't report it for a couple of reasons. First is, once you've got a proven reserve like that, you have to pay taxes, if I understand the law correctly. And the second was, at that time, there was maybe an acre of land just to the northwest of the existing pit that was still deeded to somebody else, an old Bisbee family, and they didn't want to sell. So PD would not have been able to expand the pit and get this. Now, the interesting thing that he told me in context was that the copper that they mine in Bisbee is part of the same geological structure that also shows up in Tucson and shows up in Cananea on the other side of the line. So I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's just some fantasy. I can't even remember the name of the engineer, With research, I could probably find out when that trip was, just to put a date on the thing. But has anybody ever heard anything like that? Or is that just, some engineer's fancy story to dazzle some kids?
Well,
Christine?
no, I just know that there were some other properties adjacent to Phelps Dodge properties that old families owned the mineral rights, and it became confusing for the sale of the property.
Yeah, again, what I remember is that it was a Swedish family.
Oh, yeah.
Some,
Ooh, Christine
That
could
would
figure.
be a question for West Patience.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I wanted to say that I was very happy to meet Bob because I was born in Ajo, and my family lived in a beautiful Phelps Dodge Mining Company house. It was one of the bigger ones. And then I was also happy to hear from Charles. So I'm just happy to meet people. And also for Mr. Malik, I knew his mother, Alicia.
oh yeah. The funny thing was, people that I was in school with would go to Cochise and they'd come back and they'd see me like during breaks or something. And they'd say, is your mom Mrs. Malik? And I'd go, yeah. They go, she's strict. I go, really? she was never strict at home. But apparently she was like Menegovich. She was just really like, damnation, don't you people read the Bible? I mean, if you remember that great line from senior
Was
English.
that someone from the Menegovich family said that?
Yeah, Anne Menegovich. She was the senior English teacher. She was
Bill,
great.
what did you go on to do? Where were you in college, and then what happened?
I went to MIT. I've stayed in the Northeast pretty much ever since. I went to work at the John Hancock as a programmer in Boston. I was there for 5 years. I went to IBM in Poughkeepsie. I was there for 12 years, also doing programming. And then I moved to Connecticut when I joined a company called Gartner doing research. I ran their information security service. And then in 2001, I joined KPMG, and then I became CTO of a startup called Waveset, which did branch of information security called identity management, and independent consultant. I now work for a company called Trend Micro, which does antivirus.
Do you ever make it back to Arizona?
I have been to most of the big year reunions.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, in fact, it was, I think 3 years ago. Is that right? So 69. So yeah, in 2019, I went back to the, that would have been the 40th, 50th year reunion. And
Of
my,
69?
I'm sorry?
Of class of 69?
Yeah. Yep. And my daughter and her husband had just come back from a 2.5 month internship overseas. And my younger daughter came out to meet us. And so the four of us were at the reunion, and the older daughter Taylor and her husband Maxfield were ballroom dancing. And so they had this dance party out at, I can't remember the name of the restaurant, but it's on the road down to Naco. And we had the whole place, and they danced. We met folks, and it was so much fun. And many years earlier, I brought my daughters down there and stayed at the Copper Queen Hotel, and more recent in between, we stayed at that 3-story lodge with the wonderful balconies just basically across from Castle Rock. So yeah, I try to get there for regularly, and I've got a lot of friends on Facebook from Bisbee High School. It was an incredible part of my growing up. Really, really love it there, and have great fondness for the place. I was born in Detroit, but I tell people I'm from Arizona. It's cooler.
What did your mom teach at Cochise College?
English.
English.
Yeah.
Love
She
that.
and Joe Gilliland were hired by Dean Harwood, who was the first president there.
William
Mhm.
Harwood.
And she retired in like 88, I think.
Does anyone know the name? There was a president of Cochise College who died in a plane crash. Christine, you probably in the early 70s.
Yeah, it was Johnson. His name was Johnson. And he was the president that was appointed before the Douglas campus was even built.
Right.
That crash happened about a year before the college opened. So
Yeah.
Oh, so that was when Harwood came in.
that's when Harwood came in, right?
Yeah,
My
because my mom,
No, go ahead.
She had interviewed with Dean Harwood in Detroit. My folks had gotten divorced 2 years earlier, and my mom had advice from the school we were going to in Ann Arbor that it would be better for our growth if we were in a totally different place. And so we went to Bisbee to be an entirely different kind of world.
Totally different place.
That's a big leap.
Yeah,
Ann
I
Arbor.
told a friend of mine that. He said, "Yeah, that's right. Bury it deep."
I don't know. My husband went to University of Michigan and he loves Bisbee. So I don't think the Ann Arbor Bisbee thing, it's not an impossible leap.
Can I just jump in here with a little comment following up on what Bill was talking about? Richard Graham, who was probably the foremost geological authority on Bisbee,
Mhm.
and from a pioneering Bisbee family, he is no longer living. But he told me a little story one day about the fact that there's some kind of geological thing that kind of runs roughly up where Tombstone Canyon is, Main Street in Old Bisbee, and that everything on the south side of that, which would be Bucky O'Neill and those hills, was had a lot of copper and gold and silver in it. Everything on the north side of it virtually had nothing.
Yeah.
Didn't, and so therefore that is one of the reasons why the mine never took out Old Bisbee and kept on going.
I just had Doug and Richard Graham. Sorry to cut you off, Charles. Were you?
Yeah, I was talking about Rich, the father.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I had them do a presentation on this because Doug has, when we do programs at the mine tour and in on Freeport land with Freeport with the kids, Doug and Richard both explained it. It's a tectonic plate. So they're two different tectonic plates. And so they're actually have been shifting. So that is the reason that they're on Tombstone. When you live on Tombstone Canyon, they say there's a scorpion side and a cockroach side. Which side do you live on? And there are different flora, different insects, and in fact, different mineral deposits because one side is moving upwards. I think it's like, 18 feet over 2 million years or something. But Richard did describe how the mineral formations were created here. He did a, 600 million year timeline. He has created a timeline on their website, and they have placed the Copper Queen Library as the marker. As you watch the epochs, the geological epochs shift and the terrain shift, the Copper Queen Library is the marker they use to place you in where we are. So
That is so cool.
It is very fascinating because I've heard all these gold stories since I moved here. I'm a newcomer compared to all of you. But Bill, I also wanted to thank you for attending tonight because we did get your email, and it was just so wonderful to have a story as soon as we put out this program. So
Oh gosh, yeah, I love the area and I'm happy to help. One thing that you just said reminded me of something. When I was in 8th grade, I went to the Lowell School, and I remember that the culvert just south of the Lowell School, just north of, I guess it's 92, there was a lot of sulfur and pyrite in there, and the water was acidic. But there was a natural spring west of where we lived in San Jose, which is the south side of the Mules, and the water there was sweet and somewhat alkali. So that speaks to the different geology there.
True. I think I'm kind of turning into a pumpkin. I realize y'all are just moving into dinner time, but
well, have we missed anybody? I feel like we've missed some people. Does anybody else have a brief story they want to share? Beth, I see you're here too.
Or if you even want to just send me your name or the name of someone you think I should talk to, that's fine too. If you don't want to share in the big group, whatever. I'm just so thrilled to have anybody and everybody here.
And so Katie's email is at the top of the
I'll
chat.
repost it in case people came late.
And then, of course, you all have my email, awilliams@bisbeeaz.gov. You can always reach out to me to connect if you misplace it or don't want to copy it tonight. Before we end, does anybody have any questions, comments, or?
Beth, did you want to say anything?
Only that I'm a historian and I'm basically a historian of Mexico. But I have been doing a project for the last couple of years in Douglas. We're doing a oral history project. And we could talk about this, but this probably isn't the right time. But
I would love
one
to.
thing that is interesting because we went after the oldest members of the community. And I'm working with, I'm working with 2 women of Mexican descent who are from Douglas. I've been living in Bisbee for a long time. One thing is that people do not generally, everyone had an idyllic childhood.
I know. I've discovered that.
Nobody talks about smelter smoke except a couple of activists.
I agree with
No
that.
one except a couple of activists talks about industrial accidents.
Mhm.
So it's been very interesting and we can talk about this.
Beth, I would love to be in touch. I hope you'll send me your
Okay,
email.
yeah, I'll do it right now. We have a website for the oral history project. so I'll put
Awesome.
that
I'm
on
so
the
glad
chat.
to make your acquaintance. I will
Yeah.
close by saying with my in-laws on that here that my grandfather was born in 1913 in Douglas, and his parents were among, I recently learned this from Cindy Hystack, the more than 60% of G Avenue merchants who were Jews in the early 20th century. I mean, I knew there were a lot but I didn't, she counted them. And so my great grandparents were Eastern European Jewish immigrants, Louis and Annie Silverman. And my great grandfather Louis co-founded the Bisbee Douglas Jewish Cemetery, which I've been to a number of times, but I just went last month. So that era is really of special interest to me. So Douglas has like a place in my heart because it is actually a home place for my family. So I look forward to hearing from you, Beth, and I want to thank you all so much. Glenn, did you want to add one more thing?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, are we included on the mailing list if we've been on this call for the future?
Oh, Allison,
So
that's a question for Allison.
I don't have a specific mailing list for Katie. My mailing list is for everybody who's signed up to receive Zoom links for program registration. So you can certainly email me after this, and I'll copy these emails. But I can. I'm going to leave this this list in particular for Katie. This is her research and program. But anything, if Katie wants to send out any additional information or requests, I can actually use the program email to send that out to everybody and people who didn't attend. And then I will post a link to this video as well on our YouTube channel, Copper Queen Library YouTube. And, you know, I would love to actually do a follow-up to this program in a couple months. So I just really want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and joining us and sharing these personal stories, but also these connections. I have to say, so far, my favorite part was when Bill said, "Hi, Charlie, I haven't seen you in 50 years.
Of course.
Just never know where you're going to run into people, you know?
Yeah. And, even though I'm, you know, not from Bisbee, I was lucky enough. I was helping with the sound and video for the class of 1966 reunion, Bisbee High School reunion, where Charles and Christine and some other friends of mine were all there. And I had a moment where I thought, wait, you guys have all known each other this long? I had no idea. So it is really wonderful to have all of you here together and sharing these stories that as we can now see from Katie's research and perspective is how each of these individual stories creates a bigger story, a new narrative, and a more complex and comprehensive narrative, going back to your Ethiopian student, Katie.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. I always like to promote younger scholars too. And Bill, I thought others might be interested too, but there's a young historian at MIT named Megan Black, and she wrote a really interesting book. So I'm pointing out to Bill because he's an MIT alum, but she wrote a book called The Global Interior. And it's actually about how the Department of the Interior, which we think of as purely domestic, right, dealing with US land, kind of promoted mineral resource use around the world. And she actually talks about Phelps Dodge cooperating in the 1950s by producing films that other countries used about mineral production. So I'm pointing out to Bill because he's an engineer, but it's actually a really, it's not about Phelps Dodge, but it has Phelps Dodge in it and shows the way that they were part of kind of a larger story. That's quite interesting. So I will throw that out there for you all. It won a number of awards, including an award from an organization that I chaired. So anyway, thank you so much. I hope that I will be in touch with all of you. I think Glenn, I'll make sure that your name gets to Allison because it sounds like you want to be on the email list.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
it is
guys.
1:00 here and I'm going to bed.
Okay, good night, everybody. Thank you so
Good
much
night.
for your
Thank you.
stories.
Nice to
Thank
see
you,
everyone.
everybody.